Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. A kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by the sun of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments. Rebellious subject enemies to peace, profaners of this neighbour-stained steel, will they not hear what, ho, you men, you beasts, that quench the fire of your pernicious rage with purple fountains issuing from your veins? On pain of torture, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground and hear the sentence of your moved prince. 3 civil brawls bred of an airy word by thee, old Capulet, and Montague.
So what is your personal connection with Shakespeare?
I was born into a theatrical family. And when I was growing up, Shakespeare was certainly the lingua franca of our house. Every action would be accompanied by a Shakespeare quote. And then in 1980, with my father, we mounted a show celebrating Shakespeare's lovers, called A Lover and His Lass, which we toured to many community centres and other places where a lot of people who had not seen Shakespeare performed ever saw Shakespeare for the first time. And it was doing the research for this that my obsession started to take off. How come a series of scenes out of context of the plays themselves could stand in their own right? And it was then that I realised that Elizabethan theatre was not the beginning, as it's often thought, but the end of a long tradition.
In what way?
It started in Britain with the miracle plays in the 12th, 13th centuries, which then developed over time into an entertainment which was popular at the time of Henry VIII, which was called interludes, which were a series of short scenes in between courses at a banquet. These interludes then became the sort of basis for plays, which developed into the early Elizabethan era. And by the time Shakespeare was writing, the plays were indeed complete works, but this sequential nature remained. For me, it all started back in 1587. I was 21 and we were touring with the Queen's Men throughout the counties of Oxfordshire and Warwickshire. We had with us the best clown of all time. Richard Tarleton was his name, and his fame guaranteed our success everywhere we played. And then on the 13th of June, tragedy struck. Oh, I will never forget that night. We had in our company a hothead, wonderful player, but when the drink was in him, oh dear, William Nell was his name. Now, in time, he started an argument with John Town, another of our players. So, the reason for the argument perhaps will best remain unspoken. We tried our best to calm them both, but John was frightened when William drew upon him, and in the ensuing confusion, John's sword finished in the neck of the unfortunate William. We lost not only a friend, but our young hero. A difficult situation when on tour. Our next date was in a town called Stratford-upon-Avon. We were well known in the town, and our performance was eagerly awaited.
The working practices of Elizabethan theatre.
Well, this is where my obsession really took off. There's been an enormous amount of research done over the years and thousands of books written on the subject. But however, most of this research has been done by academics within academic institutions for other academics. And as I delved deeper and deeper into this research, I realized that there is an element that is constantly missing. The practicalities of working as the players did. I discovered, for example, that an average company would perform 150 different plays a year. That the same play was almost never performed twice on consecutive days. And the players only had access to their lines, to their cue scripts, and would probably not have known what the rest of the play was about, and certainly not have read it. Now, nobody, of all the research that I had done, nobody had really addressed as to this question, as to how this could be possible. The academics had looked at it and had observed it, but nobody had said, wait a minute, how can this be done? And my research led me to a specific discovery, which is not often mentioned, that there was a plot sheet. And the plot sheets were, and there's one plot sheet that still exists, which is extant, which is very similar, almost exactly the same as the plot sheets from the Comédie de l'Arte tradition. Which means that the actors, the players, must have been working in very much Comédie de l'Arte processes, even if the words that they were to utter were very, very strictly controlled and censored. When we arrived that summer, we were greeted by John Shakespeare, alderman, glovemaker by trade, and we were to be lodged in the White Swan, the tavern next to his house. Young Will was his son, and he joined us as we ate. He told us that he had always been fascinated by playing, and that he had been taken to see a pageant at the age of 11 at Kenilworth, which seemed to have left an entrenched impression upon him. He also told me that he had often stolen off to watch the Commedia dell'arte troupes at the illegal performances. Brave boy, for the penalties for that were severe.
So you spent a lot of time looking at the academic research and then trying to apply it to the way that a performer of the time would perform it.
Well, yes, I've been a performer and a director all my life, and I've had a very hands-on approach to the realities of working in a theatre, which I brought to this research. I tried to put myself in the skins of these players and see how this could possibly have been achieved, because they worked together and they stayed together. The principal company stayed together for over 50 years, and they continued to work in this way for over 50 years, and they were enormously successful. So they must have been getting something right.
What exactly was the social position of players and the theatre in London at this time?
Much the same as we would view the soap operas of TV today. The leading actors are very popular and they made a lot of money. The hired men made a living, if they were competent. But the plays as such were considered of no literary merit and decried as pretty much being populist entertainment, certainly by the literati of the day. There were two sorts of playwrights. There was the amateur and the professional. Amateurs were men of letters, usually aristocrats, such as, for example, Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, who was a man of letters and certainly was renowned for writing comedies. These amateur playwrights would consider their oeuvres to be works of art. Unfortunately, in the case of Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, none of his works have survived, so we cannot judge. The professionals like Shakespeare, Johnson, Webster, Beaumont and Fletcher were considered hacks, and their output of no particular literary merit whatever. Sir Thomas Bodley, the founder of the Bodleian Library, refused absolutely to have plays in his library, referring to them as baggage books. So I think the equivalent today would be the way we view the scripts for EastEnders or Sex and the City, populist entertainment. Yes, okay. So the royalty and the aristocrats were very partial to plays and playing, but the royalty and aristocrats have never really been judges of artistic merit.
But these were works of extraordinary artistic merit.
Well, we think so today, but they were certainly not considered so at the time. There is, in various books, a mention of around 5,000 plays having been written or performed during that period. Around 230 of those survive. Of that 230, 36 are Shakespeare, which is quite an extraordinary percentage. The quality of those 4,000 odd lost plays we can only imagine. Which is what makes Hemings' contribution so remarkable. Because it's fair to assume that he was among the very few who recognized just how extraordinary these were.
Yeah, well, that brings me actually to my question about your relationship with John Hemings and why did you write this play?
Well, as I did more and more research, his name kept cropping up, being the person named for receiving money on behalf of the company, chamberlains and later the king's men. Letters addressed to him from the Chamberlain's office concerning the activities of the company, his name on the folio. He's a benefactor in Shakespeare's will. Shakespeare leaves him £1 6 and 8 to buy a ring. He's also an executor for Shakespeare's will. So they obviously had a professional relationship which went on for many, many years. And I started to have empathy with John Hemings, because perhaps he was the only person who really, really knew and understood quite just how extraordinary these plays were, and to be working so close with the genius. And yet to be frustrated that nobody else is recognizing this genius. We know very little about him, very little. We know his birth date, his death date. We know that he married the widow of an actor. About his children. We know that he was a member of the Grocers' Guild. There are no portraits, so I felt very free to create him perhaps around myself, partly because I felt such an empathy with him and his position.
When was the folio printed?
1623. For 7 years after Shakespeare's death. We know that they started printing in 1621, so we know that it took about 2 years to print, which is not really surprising given the size of the project. It's 1,000 pages. 18 of the plays appear in the folio for the first time. So we can imagine that without the folio, those 18 plays would almost certainly have gone the way of the 4,000 plays that I mentioned earlier. This was indeed to prove a problem for Henry and I when we were collecting the manuscripts, as young Will would write on the Q script, leaving the scrivener to create the prompt book later once we, the players, had learnt our parts. Ralph Cray, now leading copywriter, was not averse to making his own changes, and I must confess to you, ghosts of the future, that much of what you shall come to discover in your time is imperfect, for many of the players' Q scripts were lost.
So the folio is the only surviving record of, let's say, half of Shakespeare's plays.
Yes, absolutely. it must have been a tremendous task for Hemings and Condell. Printing was an incredibly laborious process. Every page obviously printed by hand. The pages are then bound into quires, which is 8 pages or 16 pages. The book itself is 1,000 pages long, so you can imagine how many quires that is. One can do the maths. And so these pages then bound into quires would have been printed, left around the workshop, while the workshop got on with other jobs which would have brought in money, because this is obviously not going to bring in any money until it's actually finished and sold, which is why it would take 2 years. So I just have to. That's why one of the reasons why I wrote the play, because I think that John Hemings. It is so unfair that John Hemings should be lost to all but to those involved in Shakespeare studies. Nobody's ever heard of him.
And in fact, it was John Hemings who actually brought Shakespeare into the future.
Well, yes, without John Hemings, there would be no Shakespeare. A printer. Who to ask? No printer seemed willing to accept so large and risky an undertaking, particularly as plays were not considered worthy of note. William Jaggard was known to us, as we had been in dispute with him several times over plays of ours that he had printed without our authorization. I went to talk to him and persuaded him that he was in our debt. He agreed, finally. His shop was large and he had a number of compositors. But it soon became apparent that he was not giving the project the priority that I would have preferred. Kept taking his best men off the project and assigning them to others. I was no longer playing, and so could pass by the shop regularly to check errors. But not regularly enough, it seems. One of the compositors was very meticulous, but the others... Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. Then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like snail, unwillingly to school. And then the lover, sighing like furnace with a woeful ballad made to his mistress's eyebrow. Then a soldier, full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honour, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the babu reputation even in the cannon's mouth. And then the justice, in fair round belly, with good capon line, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part. The 6th age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful hose well saved, a world too wide for his shrank, and his big, manly voice turns again toward childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. Last scene of all, that ends this strange, eventful history. is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything.